Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give folks a few minutes to log on. So welcome, and we're going to give a couple minutes for people to join the webinar, and want to thank you for joining us today. Again, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We're glad to have you with us. My name is Steve Jewell. I work with Community Giving, and we're glad to have you with us today as we talk about giving opportunities in a low interest rate environment. We're giving people just a couple more minutes to log on, and then we'll get started. We appreciate you joining us today. Okay, I think we'll get started, and I know people have been going back and forth and being on a lot of people have been on a lot of webinars, so we may have some others joining us. But again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Steve Jewell. I work with Community Giving, based here in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and we partner with a number of community foundations in our area. And we started this as just a way to stay in touch with nonprofits in particular, and do what we can to support many of you who are on the front lines. You know, we're all going through a lot of challenges, and quite honestly, a lot of people also going through a lot more challenges than some. And so we know that as especially nonprofits, you're there and providing support the best you can given the circumstances, and we just want to say thank you for what you're doing. And we see it as one of our roles is to do everything we can to support you in your work. As we have started these, we just a couple of housekeeping things. Please keep your microphone on mute. We will, as time allows, have question and answers, but we encourage you to ask the questions as we go, and then just at the tab at the bottom of the screen, and then we will answer them as we go, and or hopefully we usually do have time for questions towards the end. As I said, we established these webinars simply to stay in touch, but also to do what we can to support your work. As we looked at our environment with low interest rates, we know that there are some charitable giving tools that are out there that really are appealing during low interest rate environments. And right now it's at historic lows. And we know that sometimes that money might not be available right away in some cases, but we also know that sometimes it helps provide a tool to support your donor, but also is there to help support the community in the long term. So I would like to introduce Carol Turnow. She's the Executive Director of the Central Minnesota Community Foundation, and she'll say a few words and then introduce today's speaker. Carol?
Hi, thanks, Steve. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We really want to talk about some unusual gifts or things that maybe aren't typically in your toolbox, but are really important during this low interest rate environment. Charitable lead trusts, if you're not familiar with them, are trusts where people can make a gift to you, and during their lifetime, the earnings goes to the charity and the assets return to the donor or their intended beneficiary later on. There's retained life estates, and then charitable gift annuities. Charitable gift annuities are a great thing for people who typically have their money stored in a CD. They can put it into a charitable gift annuity and earn a higher rate of return on that and still be supporting their charities as well. Some of these gifts are things that you don't typically think about doing as a small nonprofit just because you don't have the capacity to be able to offer these. We want you to know as a community foundation in your area you can establish an agency fund with the community foundation, and we can then manage those gifts for you. So with that, we're excited to introduce Joe Thiegs to talk to you a little bit about these types of gifts and how you can best utilize them. Joe is president and owner of the consulting firm General Works LLC. It specializes in plan giving consulting and training, values-based estate planning, and family philanthropic advising. Among his roles as a consultant, Joe is a vice president and representative of Thompson and Associates and is the national plan giving advisor for Greater Public. Until making consulting his full-time occupation in 2019, Joe was the plan giving director at Minnesota Public Radio and American Public Media in St. Paul, Minnesota. Prior to that, he worked as an associate director of advancement at the University of Minnesota Law School as a plan giving officer at the University of Minnesota Foundation, and as an estate planning attorney at Dorsey, Whitney, and Whitney in Minneapolis. Joe is a regular speaker, presenter, and trainer on topics related to plan giving, philanthropy, and estate planning, including several years as a presenter to the Minnesota Plan Giving Council. He's currently on the board of directors of Minnesota Plan Giving Council and is a member of the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners. Previously, he served for several years as the governing council and the legislation committee of the Minnesota State Bar Association's probate and trust law section, and was a member of the MSBA Joint Task Force evaluating and making recommendations for adoption of Minnesota's version of UPMIFA. He earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science and Sociology from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and his JD from the University of Minnesota Law School in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Please welcome Joe Thiegs.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Thanks for the very kind introduction, Carol, and to Steve for inviting me to be with all of you here today. I'd just like to take a moment to give a little bit of an overview of what we want to talk about today. If you could advance to the next slide, Christine, please. The first thing is to provide a little bit of context. Why are we talking about this? And then just a very brief overview of various types of planned gifts, many of which you may be already familiar with, but can't hurt to have a little bit of a refresher. Then we're going to talk a little bit about something called the Section 7520 rate, which is important for understanding how this low interest environment affects different aspects of these charitable gift types. We'll talk a little bit about charitable gift annuities, retained life estates, that's typically with gifts of real estate, and then charitable lead trusts. Next slide, please. So the threshold question, why is this important to do? Why are we spending the time, the resources, and the effort when we've got all these other really important pressing needs? And what are we trying to accomplish? So why is this important? Well, first of all, we're trying to do some planning and some work with our donors for the long-term strength and viability of the organization. This is often accomplished through endowment, and I know community giving holds endowments for benefit of nonprofit organizations in the area. That's a way to reduce reliance on less reliable sources of income, provides for a smoother revenue stream in rough economic times, and then also to provide perpetual support for the organization, so that when you do have economic downturns, drops in annual giving and support, that there's this other resource that's there to help shore up the mission of your organization. And then another reason is that this is a way for donors to provide more and larger gifts for your organization, not just through their planned gifts, but many times people will actually increase their annual support and their major gift support after committing to a planned gift. What are we trying to accomplish? Well, this is really the same thing that we're always trying to do, and that's to build and maintain stronger relationships with our donors and create and expand those connections between the donors and our organizations. We want these deeper and closer relationships and to let supporters know that they can make gifts using things other than cash. Much of planned giving is as simple as that. When we're talking about making annual gifts, usually we're asking for cash gifts, cash support. And for many of our donors, what they have in their checking accounts is a very small portion of what they own overall. If you think about your own situation, I don't know about you, but for me, what we have in our checking account often isn't as much as we'd like, and there's all these other competing needs. We've got our mortgage and entertainment options and food and various other things that we're trying to budget in addition to all these requests from nonprofit organizations. So when you're asking only from cash, you're asking, first of all, from this small bucket, and secondly, competing with all of these other demands. And we want to open up the range of property that can be used for charitable gifts, and just for people to know that they can use real estate, or they can use appreciated stock, or sometimes even tangible personal property. That really expands the possibility of the scope of gifts that people can make. Okay. We want to address donor fears and provide solutions to problems or issues that they may have. So a lot of planned giving is simply problem solving. And ultimately, at the end of the day, help donors make a bigger difference for others. Okay, so the next slide, please. There are various types of planned gifts. Some of the most common ones you'll see listed here. I think most of you are probably familiar with bequests. That can come in the form of a gift through someone's will or the revocable trust agreement. Another very common type is a beneficiary designation on a retirement account. So 401k, IRA, 403b, 401a, those are all accounts that many people have, and for many people, it's one of the largest assets that they own, maybe the largest asset that they own in some cases. And so that's something that we're promoting more and more, and encouraging people to promote more and more, are those beneficiary designations of retirement accounts. And there are also some special tax benefits to doing that, so that it often is the most tax smart asset that people can leave at death, are those beneficiary designations of retirement accounts. Also, you can have beneficiary designations on life insurance policies that people may have and not necessarily need to direct to the people who they had originally designated them for. There are life income gifts. Typically, that's charitable gift annuities and charitable remainder trusts. We won't be talking too much about charitable remainder trusts today, except for to mention them a couple of times in passing, but we will be focusing a little bit on charitable gift annuities. All right, next slide, please. Charitable lead trusts, as you heard Carol mention, is another type of gift that we'll talk about a little bit today. And then gifts of real estate interest. I think this is often an overlooked option for people who are potentially interested in providing major support to your organization, because they just don't realize that they can use real estate, or they don't know that the organization might be able to accept real estate. And even if your organization isn't able to accept a gift of real estate, you could do that through community giving, for example. So you can talk to your friendly neighborhood community foundation representative about that option. So various ways to make gifts of real estate. One way, and probably the simplest, is an outright gift, that you deed property over to the charity. Now, there are some threshold questions and evaluations that have to be gone through first to see if it's property that is appropriate to give to the charity, and whether they're willing to accept it. But if it is, then that can be a really great way to make a gift. And that can be all of a piece of property or part of a property. There's something called a bargain sale, and essentially that's simply making a contribution of property in exchange for less than its full fair market value. So for example, let's say you had some farmland that was worth $300,000, and you still wanted to benefit from it in some way, but you didn't need the whole $300,000, and you wanted to make a gift to the community foundation or to your nonprofit organization. What you could do, if the organization is able, is to sell it to that organization at a discount from its fair market value. So let's say then you sold this property worth $300,000 to community giving for $100,000. Then you have $100,000 in your pocket. The organization has a piece of property worth $300,000 they can turn around and sell and put the proceeds to use for the purposes designated by the donor, or for its general mission and purposes. And then the donor also gets a fair market value for the charitable portion of that contribution, which in this example would be $200,000. So that's an option that some donors are not aware of. It can be given as part of an estate plan, either through a will or something called a transfer on death deed. Transfer on death deeds have been around in Minnesota now, I think since 2008 is when they were first enacted. And essentially, it allows you to make a revocable gift of real estate to an individual or to a nonprofit organization. So the donor would have their attorney draft up a will. It can be recorded, and then it's recorded with the county recorder's office that essentially it says that I deed this property to the organization or individual upon my death. And then at any point subsequent to that, before they pass away, they could revoke that. They could file a revocation or change the transfer on death deed to someone else. But then if they don't do that before they pass away, then it becomes the property of the person named in the transfer on death deed at death. So that's another way that nonprofit organizations have benefited from gifts of real estate in about the last dozen years or so. If the donor wants an income stream and has real estate, they can convert that property to an income stream through what's called a flip CRUT. We won't go through all the ins and outs of how that works, but essentially the donor contributes the real estate to the trustee of a trust that would pay them once the property is sold, a percentage of the trust's value revalued annually. So let's say it's $100,000, well, maybe it's a $300,000 piece of property, and it's a 5% payout once the property is sold. Then they would get that $300,000 times 5% that first year, and then if the investments increase, they would get an increased amount every year. Of course, they could get a decreased amount too if the value of the assets go down over time. But that's one option for people to get an income stream from property that might not be producing income right now. There's also something called a retained life estate, and we'll be talking about that very shortly as well. Okay, next slide, please. Going back to the life income gifts, as we mentioned, there are charitable gift annuities. There are a couple of different kinds of that. There's an immediate gift annuity, which is the most common kind. And with one of those, a donor contributes property and starts receiving income immediately or within the next pay period. There's something called a deferred gift annuity, where the donor can say, I'm transferring this property now, but don't pay me for more than a year, for some point in time down the road, more than a year from now, in exchange for a little bit higher payout. And that's an option that some donors like, especially if they're trying to do some planning for retirement. Charitable remainder trusts, very similar to a charitable gift annuity. A donor's transferring property in exchange for this income. There's the CRUT, the charitable remainder unit trust, which is an example I just gave in talking about the real estate, is a percentage of the property revalued annually. So that payment can go up and down over time as the investments of the trust go up and down. There's also something called a charitable remainder annuity trust, or a CRAT. And that is very similar to the gift annuity in that it's a set fixed amount every year for the donor's life or for a term of years. Most of the time, when given the choice between a gift annuity and a charitable remainder annuity trust, the donor will pick the CGA, or the gift annuity, because it is simpler, it's easier to set up, it costs less, you don't necessarily have to go to your attorney to have it implemented, and then ongoing administration costs are less. But there are some circumstances in which it could make sense to do the charitable remainder annuity trust instead. Next slide, please. So before we jump into the examples that I prepared, I wanted to talk a little bit about a concept that's important for understanding how all of this works. And this is the low interest rate environment piece. As many of you probably are aware, if you set up a bank savings account or checking account, it's probably earning next to nothing in terms of interest. And a lot of that is based on the treasury yields and what the bank set for their certificates of deposit, and their savings account rates are all tied into this low interest rate environment. Another thing that's affected by that is the projected value of annuities and remainder interests as far as the IRS is concerned. So there's something called the Section 7520 rate, that's often referred to as the applicable federal rate, or the AFR, and the IRS updates this amount, or this percentage, monthly. They usually publish it in a revenue ruling about the 18th of each month. and it's used to determine the present value of annuities, remainder interest, and life estate. It's part of the calculation for valuing all of those things, and hence calculating charitable deductions too. So the charitable deduction that a donor would get for making a gift of one of these types is all tied into the Section 7520 rate that the IRS publishes monthly. And really what it is, it's the rate at which the IRS is assuming for purposes of these calculations and determinations, what they think that the asset values are going to do in terms of growing over the years. Now, even though we might have very low AFR rates, and for right now in April, the rate is 1.2%, for example, I think that most people, even at the IRS, wouldn't assume that property that's invested is going to grow at 1.2% forever. Right now, that's what the assumption is for this month. And you can do a little bit of arbitrage if you have assets that you expect to grow more than 1.2%, for example, over time. And the assumption in doing the calculation today is that it will grow at 1.2% over time. So this is especially helpful when we talk about the retained life estate and the charitable lead trust a little bit later on. But just to know that AFR, applicable federal rate, Section 7520 rate, that's the percentage at which the IRS is assuming that these assets will grow over the term of the charitable interest, or the remainder interest, if it's a remainder interest. It's defined as 120% of the applicable federal midterm rate, rounded to the nearest 0.2%. What this means is that for purposes of valuing loans, a midterm loan is a loan that is more than 3 years and up to 9 years. So that's just how the rate is defined. Next slide, please. As I said, it's updated monthly. Historically, we are at a low as of May 1st. I don't think that there has ever been a rate lower than 0.8%. It has gotten down to 1% a couple of times. In late 2012 and early 2013, it got down to 1%. But I don't think we've ever been in territory like we will be coming up next month with an AFR or Section 7520 rate of less than 1%. So we'll see how that plays out in some of the calculations. In contrast, the highest it's ever been is right about the time that they started publishing the Section 7520 rate. Back in 1989, it was 11.6% in May of 1989, which is a pretty big difference. The highest it's been in the last 20 years, last couple of decades. 20 years ago this month, in April of 2000, it was 8%. So you can just see for comparison, it's ebbed and flowed. Typically, over the last few years, it's been at historical lows, and a lot of people have been engaging in some of these planning techniques and charitable giving techniques, but right now is about the best time for some of these things like charitable lead trusts and retained life estates, as we'll see. And an important thing to know too is that when you're calculating a charitable contribution or charitable deduction, and I should have qualified this to say for something like a charitable gift annuity, charitable remainder trust, that the donor can elect the applicable federal rate either for the month in which the gift is made or for either of the 2 prior months. Next slide. So the first of these gifts that we're going to talk about is the charitable gift annuity. It's one of the oldest plan giving vehicles around. The first one in the U.S. was established at Yale University in 1831, when an artist by the name of John Turnbull contributed to Yale College a collection of paintings. He was a well-known Revolutionary period artist and contributed this collection of paintings to Yale in exchange for income. And that, to my knowledge, or as far as I know, that gallery is still there at Yale. There's an organization in New York, I think it's the American Bible Society, that's had charitable gift annuities continuously operating since 1848. So they've gone through the Civil War, several world wars, and they're still operating that program. So it is a rather safe form of giving in terms of income for donors, assuming that the organization is a financially strong one. The way it works is it's a contract between the charity and the donor. It's an agreement that's typically drafted by the donor. The donor makes a contribution or a gift of cash or other assets in exchange for the charity's promise to pay them a certain fixed amount of income for the rest of their lives. And then at the end of the annuitant's life, the amount that's remaining goes to benefit charity. And this obligation is a general obligation of the charity. So it's not like once the original funds that the donor contributed have run out that the charity doesn't pay anymore. These are backed by all of the assets of the charity, just like any other creditor would be able to enforce, so that essentially, as long as that nonprofit is in existence, it has to pay out that annuity to the donor. So it's backed by all of the assets of the charity. How CGA payout rates are set. Those are set by the American Council of Gift Annuities, and there's a link to the ACGA website there if you want to go on and take a look and learn a little bit more about that. Basically, the older the gift annuitant, the higher the gift annuity rate. Typically, they range from about 4% for most organizations. Well, really, it starts even at age 1 or 2, you could have a 0.1% gift annuity, but no nonprofits that I know of have policies that permit it. Most of them permit it starting at age 55 or 60 or 65, or sometimes even higher in age. And so if you're looking at someone aged 55, 60-ish or so, all the way up to their 90s, it generally ranges from maybe about 3.6% up to a maximum of 9% for an individual, or 8.8% for a couple who are in their 90s. This was last updated in November of 2019, effective January 1st of this year. And the ACGA Rates Committee typically meets in April to make decisions, and then whenever the economy or economic circumstances warrant it. I have to imagine that they're evaluating that really closely right now. In fact, probably literally today, the ACGA conference, it's an annual, or I guess it's an every 2-year conference, is going on right now virtually. And they were going to have a plenary session at, I think it was over lunch today. I'm not participating in that conference, so I wasn't able to see if they made an announcement about what's going to happen. But I would guess that they'll probably end up lowering gift annuity rates a little bit more coming up sometime soon. And another thing to note with the AFR, that Section 7520 rate being in really low territory right now, there is a chance that if the payout rate is at a certain level, that that it will not qualify for a 10% remainder going to charity, depending on what the age of the donor is. So I just did a couple of calculations in the last couple of days, and for example, at an ACGA recommended rate, it fails that 10% remainder to charity test for couples who are under age 64. And so, well, 64 and 63 works, but if both of them are age 63, the ACGA recommended rate currently would fail if it's at the 0.8% AFR assumption, because the assumption is that the assets aren't growing very quickly over time. So I'm sure that that's something that the organization will look at. Not all charities follow the ACGA rates, but probably 90-some% of charities who issue gift annuities do follow those ACGA rates, and it is the suggested maximum payout that the organization would pay. But I would guess that community giving and its affiliate community foundations subscribe to the ACGA rates, but I can be corrected if necessary following these comments. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the first example I wanted to show you about a charitable gift annuity. One thing that I want to point out is that typically for a life income gift, a charitable gift annuity, a charitable remainder trust, the lower income, the lower interest rates and lower AFR, lower Section 7520 rate is is bad for people who want a higher charitable deduction. So that's not the reason that we're talking about gift annuities today. In fact, with the lower AFR rates, people get a lower charitable deduction. But one of the reasons that we think that gift annuities could be attractive to a lot of donors in today's climate is because there are other safer income options are much lower payout right now. For those donors who have CDs and they roll them over, maybe if they took out a CD several years ago, the rate that they would get when it comes due now is going to be much, much lower. And in having a fixed income, especially in a volatile market when values are going up and down so quickly in investable accounts, a fairly fixed annuity sounds very attractive. So one difference between a charitable gift annuity and a commercial annuity, I'll note, for commercial annuities, typically donors can get a higher rate, but then there's no gift to charity because essentially the gift is the insurance companies or annuity companies' profits. And that goes to a private entity. Whereas with a charitable organization issuing a charitable gift annuity, there's the expectation that approximately 50% of what was originally contributed, that's the assumption under the ACGA rates, that about 50% of the amount originally contributed will end up going to benefit the cause designated by the donor. And that's based on some fairly conservative investment return assumptions. I think the current assumption that they use is a return of about 4.25% on the invested assets over time. So that's the idea. It's a little bit lower rate than they could get from a commercial life insurance company, but it's still a significant income that they can get from this and make a really great gift to charity at the end. In this illustration, you'll see that the donor had property that was valued at $100,000, and in this case, they used long-term capital gain property, appreciated stock that they had originally bought for $50,000, so that was their basis in it. And ordinarily, if they sold that and then gave cash, they would end up having to pay capital gains on the $50,000 of gain. Well, when they instead give that to charity in exchange for a charitable gift annuity, they bypass part of that capital gain, and the rest they get to recognize over their joint life expectancies as opposed to all at once in the current year. So here we have Ole and Lena Olson as our 75-year-old couple who decided to make this gift for this charitable gift annuity. As you can see in that top left box, they contribute the property to charity, $100,000 with the basis of $50,000. And then in this case, the partial bypass of that $50,000 of gain might save them $2,845. And this is assuming a 24% federal income tax rate. This doesn't include state income taxes. So in a state like Minnesota, where we do have income taxes, that there could be additional savings there. And then the income tax deduction of $37,938, so almost $38,000, could save them another $9,000 just on federal taxes alone if they're in that 24% bracket. Of course, if they're in a higher federal income tax bracket, they'll save even more. And in a state like Minnesota, with an income tax, they'll save even more than that. So now this is an example of someone taking advantage of that rule that I mentioned a little while ago about the Section 7520 rate, where the donor can elect to use for purposes of calculating the charitable deduction, the AFR either for the month of the gift, which in this case is April, or either the 2 prior months. Well, as I mentioned, the AFR for April is 1.2%, but 2 months ago, in February, it was 2.2%. So in this example, they took advantage of that election to increase their charitable deduction by using that higher AFR. And so the donor can choose whether they prefer to have either a higher charitable deduction, or if, for example, it's someone who doesn't itemize deductions, or maybe they just prefer to take advantage of having more tax-free income. If they choose a lower AFR, they can get a larger portion of their annual, quarterly, monthly payment to be in tax-free return of principal. So there's that balancing act. Some people like to have a higher tax-free portion of their gifts, and other people like to have a higher charitable deduction. In this case, these donors wanted a higher charitable deduction, so they elected to take that that AFR from February, even though they made the gift in April. So the annuity rate, according to ACGA tables, for a donor couple ages 75, based on their life expectancy, is 5%. So then from this $100,000 gift, they would get $5,000 a year, every year, as long as either of them is living. And of that, it's broken down so that 1,892 of it is capital gain of that annual payment of $5,000. So that's recapturing that capital gain over their life expectancies, their joint life expectancy. $1,893 is tax-free return to principal. So that's the tax-free part. And then the rest, $1,215, is ordinary income. And after they reach the end of their joint life expectancy in 20 and a half years, then the rest of their payments would all be ordinary income after that. But as I say to people, that's a good problem to have, because it means you've outlived your life expectancy. So many people would be happy to pay that ordinary income tax rate if that's the trade-off. Then once both of the donors have passed away, whatever is left of that gift annuity goes to the charity to be used for the designated purposes or for the charity's designated purpose. And here you'll see it illustrated $100,000, which is the same as the originally contributed amount, even though you might notice that I said a moment ago that the ACGA rates are designed with an expectation that there will be at least a 50% residue or amount left after the life expectancy, or the second death, or the first death if it's a one life gift annuity. But as we've seen time and time again over the past 20 years, 30 years, almost for any period, the actual return is going to be higher than that 4.25% that the ACGA is conservatively estimating. So most organizations will see over a longer range of time for their whole pool amounts received from the charitable gift annuities approximately equal to the dollar value that was originally contributed. Now, you'll of course know that over time, a dollar 20 years from now is not worth the same as a dollar now, but for purposes of illustration and simplicity, that's what we show. Okay, next slide, please. In the second example, I wanted to show an example of someone deciding to give a gift of cash, and this one is in May of 2020, so it's with that very low AFR rate. And even with that very low AFR, let's say the donor made a contribution to the community giving, one of the community foundations, for $50,000. And received the annuity in exchange for that. Again, this is for the same couple, and at age 75 for both of them, the rate is 5%. So they would get $2,500 a year for this annuity. And in this case, it's a couple who itemizes deductions. So I'm sorry, who does not itemize deductions. They take the standard deduction. And so you'll see the income tax deduction here is $15,230. Which is less than the standard deduction. They may have some other deductions that would put them close to the standard deduction, or maybe even a little bit over, but in their decision making, they decided that they prefer to have a higher portion of each of their payments to be tax-free over the rest of their lives. So they took advantage of that lower AFR to make a higher percentage of their annual payments tax-free. So in this situation, the way it would look, again, if they're in that 24% federal tax bracket, that if they did itemize, they could deduct $15,230 and save about $3,600, $3,700 immediately from that deduction. But even if they didn't, they'd have this annuity of $2,500, and the tax-free portion of that is almost the whole thing. It's $2,120, and then the balance, $380, would be ordinary income. And just to point out, if they had elected the March AFR the 2 months prior, in this case, if they make the gift in May, the March AFR is 1.8%. That would have yielded a deduction of almost $18,000, $17,970, and a tax repayment of $1,953 versus the $2,120. So it's just a balancing act or choice as to what each donor wants to do. Then at the end of the day, the charity receives whatever's left in the annuity balance, in this case of approximately $50,000. So this is a way for a donor to maybe convert their cash where they're earning next to nothing in a retirement account, or maybe they've sold some other property, or they've got this $50,000 from some other source that they're trying to decide how to put it to use. They can earn 5% for the rest of their lives off of it, which looks pretty good to a lot of folks right now, and make a substantial charitable gift to their favorite nonprofit organization. Okay, so the next slide. Now we're going to pivot a little bit and we'll talk about retained life estates. Now, the benefits for these next two types of gifts, retained life estates and charitable lead trusts, are directly tied into that Section 75/20 rate. So they are dependent on how high or how low that number is, as opposed to a charitable gift annuity, which might just be a comparison of investment alternatives that the donor has. With the retained life estate, as we see, the donor irrevocably deeds property to the charity while retaining the right to use that property or live there for the rest of his or her lifetime. The donor gets a current charitable deduction for that, which is the actuarial value of the charity's remainder interest. So basically the way that's calculated is you take the present value, or you take the value of the property contributed minus the value of that retained life estate, what the IRS considers that to be worth. It's wise to have an agreement with the charity to have the donor continue to pay taxes and expenses for maintenance and insurance while they're living in the property and using the property. That should be something that's discussed beforehand, and then the donor would be responsible for making those payments. And then when the donor passes away, that life interest is extinguished, and then the charity owns the property. So what does that look like? The next slide, we'll see an example of that. So here we have a situation where Lena, who's age 75, has some property worth $400,000. And that could be a cabin, it could be farmland, it could be her residence. And in this case, the total value of the property is $400,000. The building's worth $300,000, and the land is worth $100,000. It's farmland. There may be some different balance there, but the donor, Lena, transfers the deed to charity and reserves the right to use this property for the rest of her life, and then is paying for upkeep and insurance and taxes. She gets at that point a charitable deduction for the value of the charitable portion of that transfer. And with the rate like it is in May, we assume that she made this gift in May 2020 with an AFR of 0.8%, and that she's in the 24% federal income tax bracket, and that there's no state income tax where she lives. So maybe she's in South Dakota and is deciding to make this gift. I want to point out too, in talking about other states, it's important to note that every state has their own registration requirements, and so you want to be careful in terms of what you're offering, or rather not offering to donors based on where they live. So if you're in Minnesota and you're a charity that is registered to or is in compliance with the state registration requirements for charitable gift annuities, generally that's fine. And I know that that community giving and its affiliate organizations can provide that service for property and donors who are in Minnesota, for example. But there are different requirements in different states. Like I know North Dakota, for example, has has additional registration requirements, and so Minnesota charities want to be careful not to be soliciting these to North Dakota residents. I'm not quite sure what South Dakota's rules are, if they're similar to Minnesota's or they're more similar to North Dakota's, but you just want to be careful about that and be talking to your legal counsel before you're talking with donors about this. And I think Steve or others could provide more information about that as well, but just wanted to offer that caveat. So in this case, though, she's in a state without income tax, or there'd be additional savings if she was doing this in Minnesota. We're assuming 3% annual appreciation in the real estate over time. You can adjust the illustrations to show a lower or higher amount of assumed depreciation, and then a 1% administrative expenses in conjunction with the sale. So here, Lena gets to live in the house for the rest of her life. She gets this immediate income tax deduction of $313,938,000. That at that 24% rate saves her $75,000 in income this year. So I mean, that's a really significant savings. Is $75,000 in a given year. That's real money. And then if she can't use all that charitable deduction in a single year, you could carry forward some of that unused charitable deduction up to 5 additional years beyond that. Then when Lena passes away, or if she decides if she's not going to use the property anymore, she can make a gift of her remaining life estate as an additional gift. Then the charity gets to use the property for its own purposes, or if it wants to sell it, it could sell the property and use the proceeds for its own purposes. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here we're showing a comparison of the 2 applicable federal rates for a retained life estate. And I just wanted to point this out to show the difference between even a year and a half ago in December of 2018 and what we're seeing in May for that 0.8% AFR for each of these. So you'll see the charitable deduction in December of 2018 for this type of gift, exact same property, same donor, would be $628,000 at the end of 2018, and is now about $820,000. The tax savings, if you assume that 24% bracket, $150,700 in 2018. If you do it today, it's almost $200,000. If they're in a higher income bracket, and even with state taxes, it's even more savings, $232,000 to over $300,000 in tax savings. So that's one thing to point out is, and this is with the life expectancy of about 17 years, is that there's a big difference just based on the difference in those assumed interest rates by the IRS. Okay, next slide, please. Did the same thing, but just showing what it looks like in terms of difference from the rate in March of 2000, so about 20 years ago, it was 8.2% to now. So that's even more dramatic. You see the charitable deduction of $441,000 to about $820,000 today. Tax savings, not quite doubled, but close to it. So that the AFR can make a big difference as to how attractive these kinds of gifts are. And to date, this retained life estate has never been more attractive than it is today for the right donor. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the last type of charitable gift that we're going to talk about is called the charitable lead trust. Charitable lead trust is one, as Carol noted, that pays income to a charity for a period of years. The donor contributes property to a trust, to the trustee. The trustee pays charity income for a number of years and then distributes the remainder to the people designated by the original donor. And typically that would be the donor's children, or trust for the donor's children or their benefit. There are cases where a donor can make themselves the recipient of the funds at the end of the charitable lead trust, and we do have an example of that at the very end. But most of the time, it's used for estate tax purposes. It can be either an annuity trust that pays a fixed dollar amount every year, or a unit trust that pays a percentage, just like the charitable remainder trust. It's helpful, I think, to think of it as the opposite of, or an inverse of, a charitable remainder trust, where instead of the charitable portion coming at the end, it comes at the beginning or during the term or the life of the trust. It's not very common because it's mostly helpful and useful for people who have federally taxable estates. And right now, with that amount being $11.85 million per person, or almost $23 million a couple, there are fewer and fewer people for whom that federal estate tax applies. But we do have those donors out there who have very large estates, and that's included in the realm of vehicles or techniques that might be beneficial to them from an estate tax planning standpoint. Also in Minnesota, we have an estate tax, a standalone estate tax, where the exemption level is $3 million per person or $6 million per couple. So it could be useful if they're interested in reducing state estate taxes too. So if we'll look at the next slide, please. We'll show an example of what one vendor calls at least a super trust. And this is an annuity lead trust. The reason they call it a super trust is that you can have either what's called a grantor or a non-grantor charitable lead trust, which the only difference being that there has been something included in the trust agreement in this trust, this super trust, that makes it taxable to the donor. So the income taxes are paid by the original donor or grantor over the course of the trust. Well, why would someone who's setting up a trust like this want to pay the taxes of the trust? And the reason is that then the trust will grow more rapidly. With a normal charitable lead trust, it's not a charitable entity like a charitable remainder trust. It has to pay taxes on the income it takes in. And if the trust is paying those taxes, then the amount to family at the end is smaller. But if the donor ends up paying the taxes, if they've got plenty of cash, plenty of other resources, that their estate is large enough that they're able to pay those taxes, then the trust can grow higher and there's a larger amount to family at the end. So this is used as a freeze technique for estate planning purposes, where the donor can essentially transfer property based on its value today or the assumed value with a low AFR, or applicable federal rate, the Section 7520 rate. The IRS is not assuming that it's going to grow at a very fast rate. Well, you may have property in there or be able to invest in property in the trust that's going to grow at a rate much higher than that 0.8%. So all that appreciation, you're freezing it at today's value and getting to subtract out the charitable gifts. So you can almost zero out the gift to family and have a very large amount going to family at the end of the trust, as we'll see. In this example, the donor, Ole Olson, he establishes this charitable lead trust that's valued at $1 million. And it uses appreciated property with a basis of $500,000 and capital gain of $500,000. And this trust will pay charity for a term of 20 years. It'll pay out 5%. So it's going to pay $50,000 a year to Ole's favorite charity or charities. And then at the end, whatever's left goes to family. And in this illustration, you'll see that yields $1 million to charity, that 20 years times 5%, and then the family at the end gets $1.8 million from this original $1 million transferred. Because of the way that this one is set up, again, the donor is paying the taxes, and in that case, the donor is eligible to take a charitable deduction for this gift that would save $340,000 if the donor is in the highest federal estate tax bracket. Next slide, please. I know we're running short on time, so we'll not spend too much more time on this, but this just shows a comparison of what it might look like for a donor with a taxable estate. So they've got a large estate. They're trying to reduce their estate taxes that they owe. The second row that you'll see is what we just saw in the last slide of this lead trust, with the principal to family being about 1.8 million. The first is what would happen if they just retained that property, let it grow at it. Oh, and it assumes a growth rate in this illustration of 7% per year, that the trust is growing at that 7%. So here, at the end of the 20 years, the property would be worth almost $3 million, but then there's an estate tax bite of about 1.2 million. So that there's about the same amount, maybe a little bit less going to family, and they've made no charitable gift. So if you see in the second row, the family gets about the same amount, even a little bit more with the AFR as low as it is right now, and they've made $1 million in gifts to charity over the past 20 years. So it can be a really powerful tool for the right circumstances. Okay, next slide. This is another example of a charitable lead annuity trust that's used not necessarily for estate tax planning, but maybe as a way to make a large gift to charity over a term of years and get a large immediate income tax deduction. So let's say that the donor sold a business or had another large income event and wanted a large immediate income tax deduction. They could do something like this, where in this case they're putting in $500,000 of cash, and it's a 20% lead trust. So it's paying out 20% of its value every year over 5 years. So it's a much shorter trust. And if we assume that it grows at 7%, they take out 5% per year. At the end of the day, charity has received 5 payments of $100,000 or $500,000, and then whatever's left then comes back to the donor at the end of the day. So that's just another example of a different use of a charitable lead trust. Some commentators have suggested this as a way to pay campaign pledges. I'm a little reluctant about that, just worried about paying off an obligation of the donor to have a charitable lead trust doing that. But I think it's a different story if the donor doesn't have an existing pledge and they just decide to establish this lead trust for the purpose of making this 5-year gift or whatever year gift to charity, not necessarily to pay off a prior pledge. So that's another example of how a gift like that might be used in this environment. Okay, and then the final page is just to summarize a couple of things. I think that plan gifts deserve extra attention, especially during and after turbulent times. I think a lot of people are feeling uncomfortable and skittish about their own finances, what they're able to do, and plan gifts provide an opportunity if they need income or if they want to defer their giving or something that's revocable and they can feel okay about taking it back if they need to. That we've seen historically that plan gifts boom after every major economic downturn, and I don't expect this one to be different in that respect. That steady income from life income gifts like charitable gift annuities could be attractive for people who are charitably minded given currently low yielding alternatives and volatile investments. Gifts of real estate with retained life estates give a higher charitable deduction when there's a low AFR. And charitable lead trusts are most effective to reduce estate taxes in a low AFR environment like we're seeing right now, and can be used to make large multi-year gifts. So that's all I have in the way of prepared comments. And if we have maybe a minute or two left for questions, I would be very happy to take them.
Well, thank you, Joe, for all of your work today and for all of your insights. We do have a couple of questions queued up that I will ask first, and I'll just remind everyone that you can go down to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and load in a question for Joe, and I'll ask it for you. So Joe, the first question is, on a retained life estate, what if the donor actually goes into a long-term care facility? Are those estate assets then protected from clawback costs at the care facility?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and the answer, like almost anything else, is it depends. I will say first of all that if there's a donor who is thinking that they might end up going into an assisted living facility or some other care facility, we don't know that about ourselves. We don't know if we might be in that situation. That generally those assets and Steve, if you've done more of these than I have, and so you might have a better answer than I do. But that gift should be out of the donor's estate if they've gone past that original look back period that the state or federal programs would use for evaluating eligibility from a legal perspective. Now, there's also the moral question about even soliciting gifts from people who might be in a position where they would need some sort of governmental assistance or benefits, and not giving away too much of your own estate so that you wouldn't be able to afford to pay for your care if it came to that. I'm similarly with like charitable gift annuities, charitable remainder trusts. We want to be careful that we're doing right by the donors and not asking them to give more than they can really afford to give, so that they will have enough to live off of and pay their bills if they need some of that care later on in life. I have heard of situations where it has been very uncomfortable, where a donor's made a large gift and it's legally the property of the charity, and then turns out later on they're in dire straits, and maybe they or a relative ask for it back, and it's a very uncomfortable situation for everybody, and especially the board of directors of the nonprofit and the staff there, who may have a fiduciary duty with respect to the property that was given to them and now belongs to the charity. Anybody else on the community giving side have anything to add to that, or to say no, you're completely wrong?
Well, Joe, this is Steve, and I apologize, but we're probably going to have to leave it here and wrap up. So we want to thank you very much for your presentation, and really the good news, everybody, is that Joe is actually going to be coming back and be doing a more in-depth webinar. We have a 2-hour time slot scheduled on May 12th, Tuesday, May 12th at 2 o'clock. And Joe is going to be speaking once again with a focus towards professional advisors. But certainly all nonprofits are welcome to join, and we encourage you to maybe bring a board member or two who might be professional advisors. They'll get credits for it. We just think this topic is timely because of this very low interest environment, and we have some amazing stories of gifts that are here today because of, in low interest and rate environments, donors took advantage of these provisions and set up some amazing gifts. Wilmer in particular has been the beneficiary of several of these, and so have other communities as well. We want to thank you all for tuning in and coming. We have had in the past updates from all of our communities, but we're going to move on from that today. And you can just check out our website at communitygiving.org. And at that site, you will find each of the response funds that have been set up in the various communities and what's happening, and where grants are available to support the nonprofit sector. And next week at 2 o'clock, we invite you to come back. We're going to have Lou Herr, who is with the Otto Bremer Trust. And he'll be talking about some of the work that the Otto Bremer Trust is doing to make funds available, again, to support your important work during these really challenging times. So once again, thank you, Joe. We really appreciate you sharing your comments with us and with the group. And thank you all for tuning in. And we wish you all the best. Stay well. And once again, thank you for all your work during these challenging times. Have a good day.
Thank you, Steve.
Mm-hmm.